So this is our question and answer session for this week. Thanks for the questions, several good ones. Some I answered via email, but I wanted to answer some of the more broad and interesting ones via the video. So starting with, we have a couple questions here dealing with Reagan's policy towards Central America. How is El Salvador different from Nicaragua? And then the issue of war on drugs and Reagan's awareness or lack of awareness thereof, and the Contras' involvement with drug running. First of all, I think you can make a case that Reagan, well, Reagan was certainly the most active post-World War II president in terms of U.S. involvement in Nicaragua, arguably the most active of any president at any point in American history, although in the 1920s, the U.S. was also very active in the country. During the 80s, the U.S. Strongly supported a very far-right wing regime in Guatemala that engaged in just horrific human rights abuses. I had a very close relationship with the military regime in Honduras, which served as a base for operation both to aid the Contras in Nicaragua and to funnel U.S. military aid to El Salvador. I had a fairly testy relationship with Costa Rica, which in the 80s was the only clear democracy in the region and which was promoting a peace initiative that Reagan thought was too sympathetic to the communist side. And had, as we'll see, a kind of on-again, off-again relationship with the government in Panama. Only with Belize did the U.S. really not have any significant involvement in Central America during the 1980s. El Salvador was in the early stages of the Reagan administration in 81 and 82. This is a photograph from 1981. Was actually the hotspot. There was much more public attention to El Salvador. There was much greater opposition to Reagan's policies. The situation in El Salvador was a right-wing, but not ultra-militaristic government. And then in 1979, a civil war breaks out between the military and communist forces backed by the Nicaraguans and to a certain extent by the Cubans. In 1980, the Archbishop of El Salvador is assassinated. The fighting becomes much worse. And when Reagan takes office in 1981, there's a real fear that El Salvador is going to be taken over by the communists, just as Nicaragua had been as well. The problem was that the government of El Salvador, which at this point was a fairly hardline military regime, was terrible on human rights matters, arguably just as bad as the communist side was. So the U.S. was backing this really, really unappealing regime. So why did El Salvador turn out to be different than the Nicaragua? Two reasons. First, the communists never succeeded in actually taking over the government. So in Nicaragua, Reagan was trying to overthrow an existing government. In El Salvador, he was bolstering an existing government. But secondly, and I think much more importantly, in Nicaragua, at least in the initial stages of the Civil War, the communists and democratic forces more or less remained in alignment. In El Salvador, by contrast, the leading democratic forces, especially the Christian Democratic Party, which is the largest democratic party in the country, kind of center-right party, sided with the military, and the military compromised and agreed to the election of a Christian Democrat named Jose Napoleon Duarte as president of El Salvador. So the United States could credibly argue that it was backing a democratic regime in El Salvador in a way that it was not in Nicaragua. And ironically, the fact that the military regime was forced to broaden itself and incorporate these democratic forces bolstered its position in the Civil War. And by the late 80s, it was clear that the communists were on the losing side. And in 1992, a peace settlement is made. Finally, with regards to Panama, Panama was really the hotbed of drug activity illegal drug activity in Central America in the 1980s. The head of Panama, after his predecessor died in a plane crash, was Manuel Noriega, who's on the screen here to the right, meeting with George H.W. Bush, was a pretty close ally of the Reagan administration during the 1980s. Everyone sort of knew that Noriega was involved in drug running, but was more or less willing to look the other way. When Noriega starts flirting with anti-American forces in '89, Bush will authorize a military intervention to take him out of office, and eventually he'll be imprisoned and will die in prison in a Florida federal prison for drug offenses. But in the '80s, the U.S. really doesn't push on this issue. The question on, to what extent Reagan was aware of this happening, almost certainly he was not. I've sent around with the link for this video a Saturday Night Live excerpt from the '80s with Phil Hartman playing Reagan, and the reason why the skit is funny is that it plays off this sense that Reagan really was not at all an engaged president. The skit imagines Reagan as a super engaged, super knowledgeable, on top of all of the minutiae of policy detail, and just playing this kind of man in the clouds approach. But the actual figure, especially in the second term, Reagan was really not actively involved in policy matters, and there's no reason to believe he had much of any knowledge about drug issues in Central America. Second questions deal with the tank ad, and the basic questions here: A, how badly did it affect things, and B, given all that was going on in '87 and '88, so we have the economic downturn with Black Monday. We have, the collapse of communism, meaning, do we really need to have all of this defense spending on the Cold War? The difficulty with Nicaragua. How is it that this ad could have been effective? And there are a couple of reasons. There is, and this shows how significant this ad actually was. There was an oral history done of the ad a few years ago by Politico, this politics magazine, which does good contemporary stuff as well, which I've sent around the link to the oral history if you want to take a look at it. I have a couple of excerpts from it here. This is an excerpt from Dukakis's advance team. And the people who were involved in the advance knew right away that they got the plan of what was going to happen. They knew this would be a disaster because Dukakis, he's not tall, he's kind of thin. They accurately sensed that he would look ridiculous in the tank, which of course he did. And the irony of ironies, if you look down at the bottom, is that Dukakis was this ultra rules person. He's the guy who would always, if there's trash on the ground, he'd pick it up and put it in the trash basket. He's still around now. He's in his late 80s. He's an adjunct professor at Northeastern. He's a great advocate of public transport. He would take, before the virus, he would take the subway to work, to his classes every day. He was someone who believed that, that you always follow the rules. And the rules at this defense plant were that once the tank was riding around in the demonstration area, for safety reasons, everyone had to wear a helmet. But of course, the image of the helmet, which was like a little too large for him and had his name on the cover, was irresistible. And this is the section of the oral history from the Bush people when on the nightly news that night they saw the video, and they knew that it was kind of gold for them, and they spent 3 days debating, how precisely can we use this in an ad. The question of why it worked so effectively. To me, the heart of a good political scandal or negative ad is that it tends to reinforce pre-existing beliefs. So, for instance, in the 2008 campaign, Barack Obama one day was at the end of the campaign. He's very tired, and he says that he's been to all 57 states in the United States. And conservative social media, this is kind of pre-Twitter era activism, but I've got a lot of play on Facebook and a lot of play on conservative blogs. And they said, this is a huge scandal. Obama, he's un-American. He doesn't even know how many states there are in the United States. And it just went nowhere as a political scandal, because everyone knew that regardless of what your opinions were about Obama in terms of his presidency, that this was a really, really smart guy. And so, the idea that he didn't know how many states there were in the United States, it was just absurd. On the other hand, if Trump said this, or if Lyndon Johnson had said it, because there was the sense maybe it was wrong with Johnson, he wasn't too smart. If there's a scandal that reinforces beliefs, that can be quite damaging. And the sense of Dukakis by this point in the campaign was that he was one of these ultra-lefty types. He was a card-carrying member of the ACLU. He had opposed all kinds of defense weapons, that he basically was indifferent to threats to American security. And even though the Cold War was coming to an end by 1988, it was not as if the world was suddenly going to become all bread and roses. And so this idea of Dukakis really playing as someone who cared about security when everyone really believed in the end he didn't really care very much about security issues. He was always involved, I believe in military defense, but there are all kinds of things I want to spend things on as a whole. So it was a way of visualizing a belief that a lot of Americans had already about him. It didn't impose that belief. If Bush, for instance, had been photographed in the exact same approach, the imagery would have had no impact at all, because Bush is a war hero from World War II. He had supported a strong military under Reagan, but the nature of the video was problematic. Next question of why didn't Quayle's performance in the vice presidential debate hurt Bush's campaign, or I guess at least hurt it sort of more than it did? There was polling in the campaign that showed that people were rather skeptical of Quayle even before the nomination, before the debate occurred. This poll is from just after the nomination, and were quite enthusiastic about Benson. But one of the lessons of 1988 is a lesson that we see repeatedly, I think, in presidential campaigns, and that is that vice presidential nominees very rarely help a presidential nominee. They can hurt, but the bar for them hurting a presidential nominee is actually very, very high. And since since World War II, certainly since 1960, when we move into these more modern presidential campaigns, there are only 3 campaigns, I think, where you can say the vice presidential nomination made a difference, in each case hurting the candidate. 2 of these were independent campaigns: 1968 Wallace, 1992 Perot. We'll be looking at Perot in our next set of classes. And in both of those cases, it was an independent who couldn't get a qualified person to serve as his running mate, and that it was clear from the sense. The third was John McCain in 2008 with Sarah Palin, the former Alaska governor. And Palin, there was statistical evidence that Palin, hurt Bush's polling efforts, McCain's polling efforts, maybe by a point or 2. And the campaign did drop, during Palin-related scandals. She did an interview with ABC where she seemed not well informed about contemporary events, and then she did this long interview with Katie Couric, who was at CBS, which was it was a disaster for the campaign. But Palin really is the exception that proves the rule. With Quayle, he did terribly in this debate, but they largely kept him away from interviews. And the vice presidential debate itself rarely makes much of a difference. Even in 2008, the Biden Palin vice presidential debate, Biden probably won that debate, but Palin did enough to sort of keep alive. If, on the other hand, Quayle had been subjected to a series of really tough sit-down interviews, he might have had more of a negative impact on Bush. The question of Biden's role in the Anita Hill hearings, which came up again in the 2020 campaign, and there are 2, really 3 basic criticisms of Biden's role. The first involves this episode, which was that there was a second woman named Angela Wright who alleged that she too had been sexually harassed by Clarence Thomas. She was not seen as a terribly credible witness. There were some holes in her testimony, but on the other hand, she would seem to have provided reinforcement to Hill, and yet Biden chose to enter into a deal with Republicans not to call her as a witness. And this was a close call. Biden's argument seems to have been, well, she wouldn't be very strong as a witness, and it would hamper relations with Republicans. But in retrospect, as you can see down at the bottom, he was criticized at the time for not calling her. And in retrospect, this was a mistake, given that ultimately Thomas is confirmed. The second is that Biden lost control of his committee. The way this process was supposed to work, as it was described to Hill, is that she would appear, she would testify, and then Thomas would testify. Thomas says, "No, I'm not going to do that." He says, "I want to testify first, and then Hill can testify. We know what her story is going to be because she's already spoken to the FBI." And Biden goes along with that. So changing the rules. And then at the hearing table, Thomas changes the rules again. He gives an opening statement using very, very powerful language. He calls the hearing a high-tech lynching, and then announces he will not take questions. Instead, he says that Hill should have to testify, and then he will take questions in response. So in effect, Biden allowed Thomas to control the nature of the hearing, which is the prerogative of the committee chair, and let Thomas testify first and last. And so the structure of the hearing really worked to Thomas's advantage and showed a weakness in administrative ability by Biden. And the third is that although Biden said from the start that he believed Hill, the questions that he asked of Hill, and we're going to see one in this video coming up, were cringeworthy questions. They didn't seem to suggest a real understanding of what she was alleging. Biden, has claimed in his campaign that he did everything he could for Hill. But we're going to listen to this is a brief video that was put together by the Washington Post that shows three snippets. One is sort of his current story, which is that he was a great defender of Hill. Second is one of the questions that he asked of Hill at the hearing, which is a eyebrow-worthy raising question. And third was a really quite tough interview that he got from the syndicated program, The View, where he seemed to be willing to apologize for how Hill was treated, the passive verb structure, but not apologize for how he treated Hill.
She did not get a fair hearing. She did not get treated well. That's my responsibility. And I committed that I am determined to continue the fight to see to it that we basically change the culture in this country where a woman is put in a position where she is disbelieved. As the committee chairman, I take responsibility that she did not get treated well. I take responsibility for that.
Can you tell the committee what was the most embarrassing of all the incidences that you have alleged?
What she wants you to say is, I'm sorry for the way I treated you, not for the way you were treated. I think that might be closer.
Well, but I'm sorry the way she got treated. In terms of, I never heard say, if you go back and look what I said and didn't say, I don't think I treated her badly.
So I think that third remark sort of gives a sense of how some, Hill defenders, sort of think towards Biden, this unwillingness to accept, that he basically screwed up in terms of how the hearing was presented. His record on Hill was not enough, obviously, to prevent him from getting the nomination. But you could imagine a kind of different Democratic nomination playing out. Let's say the final candidacy had been him against Warren or him against Harris, where the Hill legacy might have played more significantly. I mean, Sanders was concerned with different kinds of issues and never really brought it up in the campaign. And then the last question, did Gingrich and the House Republicans offer an actual solution to the large deficit, or did they simply say that Bush was wrong to raise taxes at all, taking an anti-approach rather than alternative offering? The answer here is the latter. There was no solution beyond an opposition to taxes and a kind of reflexive argument that lowering taxes and perhaps cutting social spending, especially Medicare and Medicaid, but not Social Security, and other discretionary programs was the way to go. And the Gingrich opposition prefigures or helps intensify in some ways the emergence of this man, Grover Norquist, a very important player in conservative politics since the 1980s to today, president of a group called Americans for Tax Reform. And Norquist will put together a pledge that Republican candidates start to sign in 1994 when they take control of the House of Representatives, and where frequently, still till today, you'll see Republican House and Senate candidates signing this pledge, in which they commit that they will not, under any circumstances, raise taxes. And so this very hardline anti-tax philosophy becomes a core principle of the conservative wing of at least the congressional Republican Party in the Bush-Gingrich fight. And so, if in effect what Gingrich is saying, although he never quite frames it in this way, is that if the country has to make a choice between high deficits or raising taxes, his choice is going to be in favor of high deficits. But that not raising taxes is his kind of baseline approach. So that's all we have for the question and answer session for this week. Again, very good questions. Hope everyone is well and is staying safe. And I will talk to everyone soon. Okay, bye-bye.